The gymnasium smelled exactly like it did 20 years ago. That unmistakable combination of floor wax, old basketballs, and teenage anxiety. Elisa Chen adjusted her simple blue dress and clutched her purse tighter as familiar faces turned to stare. She'd almost stayed home tonight, but something had pulled her back to Jefferson High's class of 2004 reunion. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was masochism. She never expected that by the end of the evening, 3 Blackhawks would land on the football field, and her former classmates would finally understand why she'd disappeared from social media 5 years ago. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The banner hanging across the entrance read, "Welcome back, class of 2004, in faded gold letters that had seen better days. Elisa paused at the registration table, watching Amanda Fitzgerald. Now, Amanda Crenshaw, according to her name tag, flipped through pages with manicured nails that probably cost more than Elisa's monthly grocery budget. "Oh my God, Elisa Chen!" Amanda's voice carried that same artificial sweetness from high school, the kind that could cut glass. "I almost didn't recognize you. You look exactly the same." The backhanded compliment hit its mark. While Amanda had clearly invested in professional highlights, Botox, and a personal trainer, Elisa's black hair was pulled back in the same simple ponytail she'd worn since senior year. Her dress came from Target's clearance rack, and her shoes were the comfortable flats she wore to work every day. "Hi, Amanda. Good to see you." Elisa signed her name on the attendance sheet, ignoring the way Amanda's eyes lingered disapprovingly on her appearance. "So what are you up to these days?" "I heard through the grapevine that you're working at some office building downtown?" Amanda's tone suggested she already knew the answer and found it disappointing. "Something like that." Elisa accepted her name tag and sticky-backed high school photo. Her 18-year-old face stared back at her, all hopes and dreams in college acceptance letters. That girl had planned to change the world. This version of herself just wanted to survive the next 3 hours. The gymnasium had been transformed with string lights and fabric draped from the basketball hoops, but no amount of decoration could hide what it really was. Round tables filled the space where they used to run suicide drills in PE class. A DJ played music from their glory days, songs that had soundtracked first kisses and heartbreaks, and the terrible certainty that high school would be the best years of their lives. Elisa grabbed a drink from the cash bar and found an empty spot near the wall. From there, she could observe, without being observed, a skill she'd perfected over the years. The popular kids had clustered together just like always, their success stories radiating outward in designer clothes and confident laughter. The athletes compared their dad bods and reminisced about state championships. The theater kids had formed their own circle, still dramatic after all these years. And then there was Elisa, alone by the wall, watching it all like she was behind glass. "Holy shit, is that Elisa Chen?" The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, former student body president and current real estate mogul, if his Instagram posts were to be believed. He approached with that same swagger he'd perfected by junior year, when it became clear he was destined for bigger things than Jefferson High. "Marcus," she nodded, taking a sip of her overpriced wine. "Damn girl, you just vanished after graduation. No Facebook, no LinkedIn, nothing. We all wondered what happened to you." He gestured broadly, including the growing crowd of former classmates who were beginning to notice her presence. "Sarah Morrison. You remember Sarah? She said she saw you mopping floors at the federal building downtown." "That can't be right, though. You were valedictorian." The words hit like a physical blow, but Elisa kept her expression neutral. Sarah Morrison had always been a gossip, but this time she wasn't wrong. Elisa did work at the federal building. She did carry a mop and bucket. She did wear a uniform with her name embroidered on the pocket. "People do what they have to do," Elisa said quietly. Marcus laughed, the sound harsh in the decorated gymnasium. "Come on, that's not an answer. What happened? Did you not get into college? Family problems? Bad decisions?" He leaned closer, and she could smell the beer on his breath. "Drugs?" "Nothing like that." Elisa set down her wine glass, her hands surprisingly steady. "Just life." But Marcus wasn't letting it go. He never had been good at reading social cues, which was probably why he'd gone into sales. No, seriously, I'm curious. You had a full ride to MIT, didn't you? Computer science or something? And now you're... He paused, letting the sentence hang in the air like a noose. Working as a janitor. The conversation around them had quieted. Other classmates were listening now, drawn by the scent of drama like sharks to blood in the water. Alyssa recognized the faces. People who had once borrowed her homework, copied her lab reports, asked for help with their college applications. People who had been perfectly happy to use her brain when it benefited them. The custodial staff keeps important places running, Elisa said evenly. Someone has to do it. Quote, but not someone who graduated summa cum laude, chimed in Jessica Torres, who had married her high school boyfriend and now sold essential oils on Facebook. What a waste. The word waste echoed in the gymnasium, bouncing off the walls and settling into Elisa's chest like a stone. She'd heard variations of it before. From her mother, who called every week asking when she was going to get a real job. From her college roommate who'd become a surgeon. From the barista at the coffee shop who'd recognized her from their shared calculus class. I mean, no judgment, Marcus continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, but you could have been anything. You could have been running a tech company by now, making millions. Instead, you're... He gestured vaguely, as if her current existence was too pathetic to put into words. I'm doing fine, Elisa said, but her voice lacked conviction. Fine? Amanda had rejoined the conversation, drawn by the crowd. Honey, fine is relative. I remember when you got that internship at NASA, the summer before senior year. You were going to work on space missions, or something equally impressive. What happened to that girl? The NASA internship. Elisa hadn't thought about that in years, but now the memory came flooding back. 16 weeks in Houston, working alongside actual rocket scientists, feeling like she was part of something bigger than herself. The engineers had treated her like a colleague, rather than a high school student. Dr. Patricia Williams, her supervisor, had written her a recommendation letter that called her the most promising young mind I've encountered in 2 decades of aerospace work. That letter had gotten her into MIT. It had gotten her full funding. It had opened doors she'd never dreamed possible. And then everything had changed. People grow up, Elisa said. Priorities shift. But you don't just go from rocket science to janitorial work, Marcus pressed. That's not growing up, that's giving up. What aren't you telling us? The circle around them had grown larger, more familiar faces, all wearing expressions of curiosity mixed with pity. They wanted the story, the dramatic explanation that would make sense of her fall from grace. They wanted to feel superior, to confirm that their own choices had been better, smarter, more successful. Elisa looked around at their expectant faces and felt something crack inside her chest. These people had moved on, built lives, achieved the dreams they'd written about in their senior year time capsules. They had LinkedIn profiles full of promotions and achievements. They had wedding photos and vacation snapshots, and children who would probably attend Jefferson High in 15 years. And what did she have? A mop bucket and a security clearance they couldn't even imagine. Sometimes things don't work out the way you plan, she said finally. Sometimes life takes you in directions you never expected. But janitorial work? Jessica's voice was incredulous. Come on, Elisa, you were going to change the world. You were going to cure cancer or invent the next internet or something. Instead, you're cleaning toilets in a government building. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, the reunion continued. Music playing, couples dancing, former teachers mingling with their former students. But in their little circle, time had stopped. Everyone was waiting for Elisa's response, for some explanation that would make her choices comprehensible. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, or deflect their questions, or simply walk away. But before she could say anything, a sound cut through the gymnasium noise, low, rhythmic, and getting closer. Helicopter rotors. At first, no one paid attention. The federal building was only a few miles away, and military aircraft occasionally flew overhead. But the sound was getting louder, more insistent, and it wasn't passing by. Is that landing on the football field? Someone asked. Through the gymnasium windows, they could see lights approaching. Not just one aircraft, but multiple. The bass thump of rotor blades was shaking the building now, drowning out the DJ's carefully curated playlist from 2004. Elisa felt her phone buzz against her hip, then buzz again, and again. She pulled it out with hands that were no longer quite steady. 7 missed calls, all from the same number. A number that only called her when something had gone very, very wrong. The gymnasium doors burst open, and a figure in military fatigues strode in like he owned the place. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of authority that made people step aside without thinking. His eyes swept the room, taking in the reunion decorations and confused faces, before settling on the circle of former classmates. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Elisa directly, "we need you to come with us, now." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The gymnasium fell silent except for the continuous thunder of helicopters outside. Every eye was on Elisa, who looked at the soldier with an expression that her former classmates couldn't quite read. Not a surprise, exactly. More like resignation. "How bad is it, Captain Morrison?" she asked quietly. The soldier, Captain Morrison, didn't smile. "DEFCON 2, ma'am. The situation in the Pacific has escalated beyond our projections. The Joint Chiefs are requesting your immediate presence." Marcus Webb's mouth fell open. Jessica Torres looked like she'd been slapped. Amanda Crenshaw's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her shock. "I'll need 5 minutes to change," Elisa said, already moving toward the exit. "Ma'am, with respect, we don't have 5 minutes. The aircraft is fueled and ready. Your gear is already on board." Elisa paused, looking back at her former classmates. They stared at her like she'd grown a second head, trying to process what they were witnessing. The quiet girl who cleaned floors was being extracted by military personnel like she was some kind of VIP. "I have to go," she said simply. And then she was walking toward the door, flanked by the captain, leaving behind 20 years of classmates who suddenly realized they didn't know her at all. The football field had been transformed into an impromptu military landing zone. 3 Black Hawk helicopters sat on the 50-yard line, their rotors still spinning, kicking up debris and programs from the homecoming game held just 2 weeks earlier. Floodlights bathed the scene in harsh white light, turning the familiar high school landscape into something from a war movie. Captain Morrison led Elisa across the field at a brisk pace, his boots crunching on the artificial turf. Behind them, the entire reunion had spilled out of the gymnasium. 200 former Jefferson High students stood pressed against the chain-link fence, their phones out, recording everything. The videos would be on social media within minutes, but Elisa knew they'd be scrubbed from the internet before morning. That's how these things worked. "Status report," Elisa said as they approached the lead aircraft. Her voice had changed completely. Gone was the quiet resignation from the gymnasium, replaced by something sharp and commanding. "Satellite intelligence detected massive troop movements along the Strait of Formosa approximately 47 minutes ago," Morrison replied, having to shout over the rotor wash. "Chinese naval forces are positioning for what appears to be a full-scale amphibious assault. The president has been moved to the bunker. PACOM is requesting immediate strategic assessment." Elisa nodded, processing the information as they reached the helicopter. A crew member handed her a tactical vest and headset, which she donned with practiced efficiency. As the aircraft lifted off, she caught a glimpse of her former classmates below, their faces pale in the artificial light, still trying to comprehend what they'd witnessed. The flight to Peterson Air Force Base took 18 minutes. Elisa spent them reviewing classified briefings on an encrypted tablet, her mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had made her indispensable to national security. The reunion felt like it had happened to someone else, in another lifetime. Inside the Secure Communications Center, she was met by General Patricia Williams, the same Dr. Williams who had supervised her NASA internship 20 years earlier. The woman had aged well, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform decorated with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished military career. "Chen," Williams said, her voice carrying both relief and urgency. Thank God we found you. The situation is deteriorating faster than our models predicted. What's the current disposition of forces? Elisa asked, settling into a chair in front of a wall of monitors, displaying real-time satellite feeds, naval positions, and classified intelligence reports. Approximately 80 vessels, including 12 destroyers and 4 aircraft carriers. They're moving under cover of a quote-quote training exercise. But the formations are all wrong for training. This is the real thing. Williams pulled up a tactical display showing the Western Pacific. The Taiwanese are mobilizing their defenses, but they're outnumbered 5-1. Japan is moving their maritime self-defense force into position, but they're treaty-bound not to engage unless directly attacked. Elisa studied the display, her mind automatically calculating trajectories, supply lines, and strategic vulnerabilities. This was what she did, not cleaning toilets or emptying trash cans, but analyzing complex military scenarios and finding solutions that others missed. Her janitor's uniform had been the perfect cover, allowing her to move through the federal building unnoticed, while she worked on classified projects that officially didn't exist. Have we identified their primary objective, she asked. Intelligence suggests a 3-pronged assault targeting Taipei, Kaohsiung, and Taichung simultaneously. If successful, they could control the major population centers within 72 hours. Williams paused. The president wants your assessment of defensive options within the next hour. Elisa's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up databases that contained information on everything from weather patterns to ammunition stockpiles. This was why they needed her. Not because she was the smartest person in the room, though she probably was, but because she saw connections that others missed. Her mind worked like a quantum computer, processing thousands of variables simultaneously to find solutions hidden in the chaos. Back at Jefferson High, the reunion had devolved into complete confusion. Marcus Webb stood in the parking lot, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to explain to his wife what he'd just witnessed. No, I'm serious, honey. Military helicopters landed on the football field and took Elisa Chen. Yes, the janitor. No, I don't understand it either. Amanda Crenshaw had cornered poor Mrs. Henderson, their former AP history teacher, demanding answers about Elisa's true identity. You had to have known something, she insisted. Students don't just disappear and become cleaning ladies. There had to be signs. Mrs. Henderson, now 73 and sharp as ever, adjusted her glasses and smiled mysteriously. Elisa was always special, she said. But some students learn that the most important work happens behind the scenes. Jessica Torres was frantically Googling on her phone, trying to find any trace of Elisa Chen's existence online. But the search results were frustratingly sparse. A high school graduation photo, a mention in the local newspaper about her NASA internship, and then nothing. It was as if she had been systematically erased from public records. This doesn't make sense, Jessica muttered to anyone who would listen. People don't just vanish from the internet. Unless... Her voice trailed off as a horrible possibility occurred to her. Unless they work for the government. Meanwhile, at Peterson Air Force Base, Elisa was deep in analysis mode. The tactical situation was worse than the initial reports had suggested. The Chinese forces weren't just positioning for an assault on Taiwan. They were creating a fait accompli that would force the United States into an impossible choice between nuclear escalation and strategic retreat. Their timeline is accelerated, she told Williams, highlighting key data points on the main display. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment operation. They've been planning this for months, possibly years. Look at the supply ship positions. They're already in place for sustained operations. And these weather patterns here? She indicated a typhoon system moving through the region. They're using it as cover, but also as a strategic element. By the time the storm passes, they'll control the shipping lanes. Williams studied the analysis, her expression grim. Can it be stopped? Stopped? No. But it can be disrupted. Elisa's fingers flew across multiple keyboards simultaneously, calling up classified databases and running complex simulations. The key is understanding that this isn't really about Taiwan. It's about testing our response protocols. They want to know if we'll honor our defense commitments when the cost becomes prohibitive. And will we? Elisa looked up from her screens, meeting Williams' eyes. That's not my call to make, General. but I can give you options that might make the decision easier. She turned back to her work, manipulating satellite feeds and intelligence reports, with the same focus she'd once brought to her calculus homework at Jefferson High. But there was a weight to this work that her teenage self couldn't have imagined. The decisions made in this room over the next few hours would determine whether the world woke up to a new Cold War, or something far worse. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Girl, what the hell just happened at the reunion? Sarah Morrison." Sarah Morrison. The same Sarah who had gossiped about seeing her mopping floors at the federal building. The irony wasn't lost on Elisa. Her cover job had been so perfect that even her former classmates had bought into it completely. They'd seen what they expected to see, a fallen valedictorian reduced to menial labor. She deleted the message without responding and returned to her analysis. In the past 30 minutes, the Chinese fleet had advanced another 12 nautical miles toward Taiwanese territorial waters. Every minute of delay brought the world closer to a conflict that could redraw the map of the Pacific. "General," she said, pulling up a new set of calculations, "I need to speak with Admiral Reeves at PACOM, and get me a direct line to the Situation Room. The President needs to see this analysis immediately." Williams nodded and began making the necessary calls. As she watched Elisa work, surrounded by monitors, her mind processing information at superhuman speed, she remembered the 18-year-old intern who had impressed everyone at NASA 2 decades earlier. That girl had possessed raw brilliance, but this woman had something more valuable: the wisdom to know when to use it. The reunion felt like it had happened in another universe, but the echoes were still reverberating through social media and text message chains across the city. By morning, everyone at Jefferson High would know that their quiet classmate, the one they'd pitied and dismissed, was somehow at the center of an international crisis. But that revelation would have to wait. Right now, Elisa Chen had work to do, and the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance. The Situation Room fell silent as Elisa's analysis filled the main screen. President Catherine Hayes leaned forward in her chair, studying the data with the intensity of someone who understood that the next decision could reshape global politics. Around the mahogany table sat the most powerful people in America: the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Director of National Intelligence, all waiting for her assessment. "Ms. Chen," the President said, her voice carrying the weight of office, "walk me through your recommendations." Elisa stood, activating a laser pointer to highlight key elements of her strategic overview. "Madam President, the conventional response would be to match their naval deployment with our Pacific Fleet. But that plays directly into their strategy. They want us to escalate visibly, to appear as the aggressor to the international community." She clicked to the next slide, showing economic data overlaid with military positions. "Instead, I recommend what I call the Silicon Stranglehold. We simultaneously freeze all semiconductor exports to China, while activating dormant defense protocols in Taiwan's chip manufacturing facilities. Within 48 hours, their military will face critical supply shortages for guided missiles and communications equipment." Quote, Secretary of Defense Robert Mitchell frowned. "That's an act of economic warfare. It could trigger retaliations we're not prepared for." "Respectfully, sir, we're already at war. They just haven't announced it yet." Elisa pulled up satellite imagery showing the Chinese fleet in real time. "These formations aren't defensive. Look at the spacing between vessels, the positioning of their supply ships. This is a textbook invasion formation, masked as military exercises." Admiral Thomas Reeves, participating via secure video link from PACOM headquarters, nodded grimly. "Her assessment matches our tactical analysis. The only question is timing. When do they make their move?" Elisa manipulated the display, showing weather patterns and tidal data. Based on optimal conditions for amphibious assault, they have a 6-hour window beginning at 0400 local time. That's in approximately 5 hours and 23 minutes. The President absorbed this information, her expression unreadable. "And you believe economic pressure will deter them?" "Not deter, disrupt. Their entire military modernization depends on advanced semiconductors they can't manufacture domestically. Cut that supply line, and their precision weapons become expensive paperweights." Alyssa highlighted specific industrial targets on the map. But there's another element to consider. This isn't just about Taiwan. It's a test of American resolve under your administration. The room grew even quieter. Everyone understood the implication. This crisis was as much about domestic politics as international relations. Meanwhile, back in Colorado Springs, the Jefferson High reunion had officially ended, but nobody was going home. The school parking lot looked like a staging area for citizen journalists, with clusters of former classmates hunched over their phones, trying to piece together what they'd witnessed. Thomas Baker, who had become an investigative reporter for the Denver Post, was frantically working his contacts in Washington. "Listen, I need you to run a background check on someone," he said into his phone. "Alyssa Chen, graduated Jefferson High in 2004. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, but I just watched the military extract her from our class reunion." His editor's voice crackled through the speaker. "Tom, you've been drinking reunion punch. The military doesn't extract janitors." "That's what I thought too. But I'm telling you, 3 Blackhawks landed on our football field, and they took her away like she was the Secretary of State or something." Dr. Angela Foster, now a prominent psychiatrist in Denver, had been quietly observing the chaos from her car. Unlike her former classmates, she wasn't gossiping or speculating. Instead, she was remembering details about Alyssa that others had forgotten or never noticed. The way Alyssa had always been reading ahead in their textbooks, finishing assignments weeks before they were due, how she'd stopped participating in class discussions senior year, as if she was deliberately hiding her intelligence. The strange phone calls during lunch that she'd taken private, speaking in what sounded like technical jargon. Most telling of all, Angela remembered the day Alyssa had returned from her NASA internship. She'd seemed different. Older, more serious, carrying herself with a gravity that didn't match their teenage concerns. When Angela had asked about her experience, Alyssa had given vague answers about classified projects and national security applications. At the time, Angela had assumed it was typical teenage exaggeration. Now she wondered if it had been the literal truth. Back in the Situation Room, the debate was intensifying. The Secretary of State had joined the meeting via secure video, arguing for diplomatic solutions that everyone knew wouldn't work. The clock was ticking toward the Chinese assault window, and every minute of delay gave them a stronger position. "Ms. Chen," the president said, cutting through the discussion, "I need your honest assessment. If we implement your Silicon Stranglehold strategy, what are the chances of success?" Alyssa didn't hesitate. 73% chance of disrupting their immediate invasion plans. 41% chance of forcing a complete withdrawal. But there's a 27% probability of escalation to direct military confrontation. Those aren't comforting odds. Madam President, comfortable odds don't exist in this scenario. Every option carries significant risk. The question is whether we act decisively now or react desperately later. Admiral Reeves leaned forward on his video screen. "What about the human cost? If this goes kinetic, we're looking at casualties in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands." Alyssa's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Sir, the human cost of doing nothing is measured in millions. Chinese occupation of Taiwan would destabilize the entire Pacific Rim. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, they'd all face the choice between submission and annihilation." The president stood, signaling a brief recess. As the room emptied for urgent consultations, General Williams approached Alyssa. "You've changed since your NASA days," Williams observed quietly. "The work changes you," Alyssa replied, staring at the tactical displays that showed thousands of lives hanging in the balance. "Every analysis, every recommendation, they all have consequences. People live or die based on whether I carry the decimal correctly." "Is that why you disappeared? Why you let everyone think you were just a janitor?" Alyssa was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what the hardest part of tonight was? It wasn't the crisis briefing or the strategic analysis. It was standing in that gymnasium, listening to people who used to respect me talk about what a disappointment I'd become." "But you knew they were wrong." "Did I?" Alyssa turned to face Williams. "Sometimes I wonder if they were right. If I'd stayed in the normal world, maybe I'd have a family by now. Kids, a house in the suburbs, a life that doesn't involve calculating acceptable casualty rates." Williams studied her protégé with the eye of someone who had made similar sacrifices. Regret is a luxury we can't afford right now. But later, when this is over, remember that you chose to serve something bigger than yourself. Not everyone gets that opportunity. The president returned, her face set with the determination of someone who had reached a difficult decision. Ms. Chen, I'm authorizing implementation of your silicon stranglehold strategy. How quickly can it be executed? Economic sanctions can be activated within 30 minutes. The semiconductor export freeze will take effect immediately for all shipments currently in transit. Taiwan's defense protocols can be triggered with a single encrypted transmission. Do it. As Elisa began coordinating with various agencies and departments, her phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was from Marcus Webb. Elisa, I owe you an apology. Whatever you're really doing, it's obviously important. Hope you're okay. She stared at the message for a moment, remembering his mocking laughter just hours earlier. Then she deleted it and returned to her work. The Chinese fleet was entering Taiwanese territorial waters, and the world was about to discover whether her calculations were correct. In Colorado Springs, the first news vans were arriving at Jefferson High. Someone had posted video of the helicopter extraction on social media before it could be scrubbed, and now every major network was trying to understand why the military had interrupted a high school reunion. The story was about to become much bigger than anyone imagined. The first domino fell at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Every semiconductor shipment bound for Chinese ports suddenly found itself delayed due to technical difficulties at American and Allied facilities worldwide. In Rotterdam, a cargo ship carrying $847 million worth of advanced chips received orders to return to port. In Singapore, customs officials discovered irregularities in documentation that would require weeks to resolve. In San Francisco, automated systems at the port mysteriously crashed, stranding 3 container vessels indefinitely. Elisa monitored the cascade from her position at the Central Command Station, watching as her economic warfare strategy deployed across the globe with surgical precision. Each delay, each malfunction, each bureaucratic obstacle had been carefully orchestrated to appear coincidental while systematically choking off China's military supply chain. Taiwanese defense protocols are now active, reported Colonel Martinez from the Pentagon's Cyber Warfare Division. Their chip fabrication facilities have implemented security lockdowns. Any attempt to capture them intact will trigger complete data destruction. The beauty of the strategy lay in its deniability. To outside observers, it would appear that various unrelated problems had simultaneously affected global shipping. Only someone with access to classified intelligence could see the coordinated pattern, and by then it would be too late to counter effectively. On the main display, satellite imagery showed the Chinese fleet had crossed into Taiwanese territorial waters, but their advance had slowed. Communication intercepts revealed growing confusion among fleet commanders as they received conflicting orders from Beijing. They're realizing what's happening, Admiral Rodriguez reported from his command post. Intelligence chatter suggests their military leadership is divided. Some want to proceed with the invasion. Others are recommending immediate withdrawal to avoid further economic damage. Quote, President Hayes studied the tactical display with the focus of a chess grandmaster analyzing a complex endgame. How long before they're forced to make a decision? Elisa pulled up a timeline analysis. Based on their current fuel consumption and logistical requirements, they have approximately 6 hours before the fleet must either commit to assault or begin withdrawal. After that point, they lack the resources to maintain their position. The genius of forcing this timeline was that it eliminated their ability to wait for American resolve to weaken. Every hour of delay cost them millions in fuel and supplies, while their military equipment became increasingly obsolete without replacement parts. Meanwhile, the situation at Jefferson High had evolved into a media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking signals. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and even international outlets had dispatched crews to cover what they were calling the mystery extraction. Amanda Crenshaw found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight as reporters sought anyone who knew Elisa Chen personally. She'd traded her reunion dress for a business suit and was holding court in the school parking lot, describing her, quote, close friendship with someone she'd barely acknowledged in high school. Elisa was always secretive, Amanda told the cameras, conveniently forgetting her earlier mockery. Even in school, she had this mysterious quality. I remember thinking she was destined for something important. Thomas Baker watched this performance with growing disgust. As a professional journalist, he recognized revisionist history when he saw it. Amanda had spent the entire reunion belittling Elisa, and now she was presenting herself as her champion. That's complete bullshit, he muttered to his camera operator. 3 hours ago, she was calling Elisa a waste of potential. But Amanda wasn't the only one rewriting history. Social media was flooded with classmates sharing memories that painted them as close friends with the mysterious janitor-turned-government asset. Photos from high school were being posted with captions like, "Always knew she was special," and "Proud to have known her back then." The irony was lost on none of them. The same people who had ostracized Elisa for her apparent failure were now competing to claim association with her success. Dr. Angela Foster had retreated to her car to avoid the media frenzy, but she couldn't escape the flood of memories that Elisa's revelation had triggered. She remembered now the subtle signs that everyone had missed or ignored. Senior year, when Elisa had stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria and instead disappeared to make mysterious phone calls. The way she'd deflected questions about her college plans, even though she'd clearly been accepted everywhere she'd applied. Most telling of all, the day she'd returned from her NASA internship and seemed to age 5 years overnight. Angela had been studying psychology even then, fascinated by human behavior and the masks people wore. She'd sensed that Elisa was hiding something significant, but had assumed it was typical teenage drama. Now she wondered if her classmate had been recruited into something far beyond their adolescent understanding. Back in the Situation Room, the tension was building toward a climax. Real-time intelligence showed Chinese military leadership in heated debate. Intercepted communications revealed that several generals were arguing for immediate withdrawal, while hardliners pushed for escalation before their window closed. Their defense minister just terminated a call with their Navy commander, reported the Director of National Intelligence. We're seeing increased signal traffic between Beijing and the fleet. Something's about to break. Elisa studied the data streams flowing across her screens. Pattern recognition had always been her greatest strength, the ability to see connections that others missed. Now she was watching thousands of data points coalesce into a singular moment of decision. They're going to test us, she announced suddenly. Not with a full invasion, but with a probe. They'll attempt to land a small force on one of the outer islands, something significant enough to gauge our response but limited enough to allow face-saving withdrawal. President Hayes turned to face her. Which island? Elisa's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up detailed geographical and strategic analyses. Kinmen Island. It's Taiwanese territory but only 2 miles from mainland China. They can claim it was a navigation error or training accident if we don't respond. But if we do respond, they'll have tested our resolve without committing to full-scale war. The assessment proved prophetic. Within minutes, satellite imagery confirmed movement of amphibious assault vehicles toward Kinmen Island. It was a perfect probe, significant enough to matter, small enough to deny. Recommendations? The president asked. We let them land, Elisa said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. But we make sure they can't leave. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. It seemed counterintuitive to allow an invasion, even a limited one. Explain, President Hayes commanded. Elisa activated a new display showing naval positions around Kinmen Island. The moment their forces touch ground, we activate pre-positioned autonomous sea mines around the island. Their landing craft become trapped. Their troops become hostages to their own aggression. They can't retreat without admitting invasion, can't advance without triggering full conflict. That's incredibly risky, Secretary Mitchell objected. What if they call our bluff? Then we find out if they're willing to sacrifice several hundred Marines to save face, Elisa replied coldly. But based on psychological profiles of their leadership, they'll choose strategic withdrawal over pointless martyrdom. Admiral Rodriguez studied the tactical projection. It could work. But the timing has to be perfect. Too early and they abort the landing. Too late and they establish a defensive position. I can execute the mine activation from here, Elisa said. Real-time satellite feeds will give us precise timing. President Hayes looked around the room, reading the faces of her advisors. Some showed skepticism, others grudging admiration for the audacity of the plan. All understood that they were witnessing strategic thinking at its highest level. Do it, the president ordered. As Elisa began the complex process of activating dormant defense systems half a world away, her phone buzzed with yet another message from Colorado Springs. This one was different, a local news alert that made her pause. Breaking, federal building janitor revealed as secret government agent, exclusive interview with former classmates. She glanced at the newsfeed and saw Amanda Crenshaw's face filling the screen, spinning tales of their supposed friendship for national television. The woman who had mocked her just hours earlier was now claiming credit for recognizing her potential. Elisa deleted the alert and returned to her work. The Chinese landing force was 15 minutes from Kinmen Island, and the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance. She had more important things to worry about than high school reunion politics. But as she initiated the final sequences for the sea mine deployment, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. The same people who had dismissed her as a failure were now competing to claim association with her success, never realizing that their opinion had never mattered at all. The first Chinese Marine set foot on Kinmen Island at 3:17 a.m. local time. Elisa watched through thermal satellite imagery as 12 amphibious assault vehicles discharged their human cargo onto the rocky shoreline. The soldiers moved with professional efficiency, establishing a defensive perimeter, while communications specialists set up equipment to relay their success back to the fleet. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been 20 years in the making. Autonomous sea mines are in position, Elisa reported, her finger hovering over the activation key. Chinese naval assets are committed to the landing zone. On your order, Madam President. The Situation Room held its collective breath. Through multiple camera feeds, they could see the Chinese forces consolidating their beachhead, their commanders likely believing they had achieved tactical surprise. Their landing craft bobbed peacefully in the shallow waters, ready to extract the troops if Beijing decided this probe had served its purpose. Execute, President Hayes commanded. Elisa pressed the key. Beneath the dark waters surrounding Kinmen Island, dozens of dormant devices suddenly came to life. These weren't traditional mines. They were sophisticated underwater drones that had been placed during routine navigation buoy maintenance over the past 5 years. Each one carried enough explosive power to sink a destroyer, but more importantly, they created an impenetrable barrier around the island. The Chinese fleet commanders watched in horror as their tactical display suddenly filled with new contacts. Where moments before had been clear water, dozens of mobile mines now patrolled in tight formation, making any approach or retreat impossible. Sir, we're receiving an encrypted transmission from the landing force, reported the communications officer aboard the Chinese flagship. They're requesting immediate extraction. Quote, Admiral Liu Qin stared at his tactical display, understanding the trap his forces had walked into. The Americans had turned his probe into a hostage situation. His Marines were stranded on a useless rock, surrounded by enough firepower to vaporize anything that moved. Brilliant, he whispered, despite himself. Absolutely brilliant. Back in Washington, intelligence intercepts confirmed that the Chinese fleet was in chaos. Multiple commanders were demanding orders from Beijing, while their political leadership struggled to find a face-saving solution to an impossible situation. They're trapped by their own aggression, General Williams observed with grudging admiration. They can't retreat without admitting invasion, can't advance without triggering full-scale war, and can't stay where they are without looking weak. Elisa monitored the communication chatter between Beijing and the fleet, her analysis algorithms identifying stress patterns in the voices of Chinese leadership. Fear, frustration, and growing panic were evident in every transmission. Estimated time until they request negotiations? President Hayes asked. Based on psychological profiles and current stress indicators, 47 minutes, Elisa replied with mechanical precision. Their defense minister is a pragmatist who values strategic positioning over face saving. He'll recognize that prolonging this standoff only weakens their position. Meanwhile, the media coverage of the mystery extraction had exploded into international news. Jefferson High School had become the unlikely epicenter of global attention, with reporters from around the world descending on the small Colorado town. The school administration, overwhelmed by the circus, had called in additional security and established a media staging area in the faculty parking lot. Principal Susan Chen, no relation to Elisa despite sharing a surname, found herself fielding questions from BBC correspondents and Tokyo morning shows about a student who had graduated before she'd even started working there. Amanda Crenshaw had appointed herself as the unofficial spokesperson for the class of 2004, giving interview after interview about her dear friend Elisa. She'd completely rewritten their relationship, describing study sessions that had never happened and heart-to-heart conversations that existed only in her imagination. "We always knew she was destined for greatness," Amanda told a CNN reporter, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had convinced herself of her own lies. Even in high school, she had this aura of importance about her. Thomas Baker watched this performance from across the parking lot, his journalistic instincts screaming at the blatant fabrication. He'd spent the night researching Elisa's actual high school record, interviewing teachers and staff members who remembered her accurately rather than through the lens of current events. The real Elisa Chen had been brilliant but isolated, respected by teachers but largely ignored by her peers. She'd excelled academically while remaining socially invisible, participating in academic competitions while skipping dances and social events. Most telling of all, she'd systematically declined every scholarship interview and college visit after her NASA internship, as if she'd already committed to a different path. Dr. Angela Foster had also been researching, but her investigation took a different approach. As a psychiatrist, she was fascinated by the psychological implications of maintaining such an elaborate cover identity for decades. The stress of living a double life, of allowing people to believe you were a failure while secretly serving at the highest levels of government, would take an enormous toll on anyone's mental health. She remembered now the subtle signs of that stress during their senior year. Elisa's increasing isolation, her reluctance to discuss the future, the way she'd seemed to be carrying invisible weight. At the time, Angela had attributed it to typical teenage anxiety about college and career choices. Now she realized it had been something far more serious. Back in the Situation Room, the predicted timeline proved accurate. Exactly 44 minutes after the sea mines activated, secure communications channels crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. "This is Admiral Liu Chen of the People's Liberation Army Navy requesting an immediate conference with American Pacific Command leadership regarding the current situation in the Taiwan Strait." President Hayes looked to Elisa, who nodded grimly. "They're ready to negotiate. The question is what terms we're willing to accept." "What do you recommend?" Elisa pulled up a strategic analysis that she'd been preparing since the crisis began. Complete withdrawal of all Chinese naval forces beyond the 12-mile limit, immediate cessation of military exercises in the region, and formal acknowledgement that the Kinmen landing was a navigation error. In exchange, we allow their Marines safe passage off the island, and don't publicize the extent of their intelligence failures. "That seems generous," Secretary Mitchell observed. "It's strategic," Elisa corrected. "Humiliating them completely would force escalation to save face. This gives them an exit that preserves minimal dignity while establishing clear boundaries for future interactions." The president considered this for a moment. "And our long-term position?" "Significantly strengthened. We've demonstrated that we can counter their aggression without military engagement, that we have capabilities they weren't aware of, and that we're willing to use economic leverage as a strategic weapon. Most importantly, we've shown their own military leadership that their current strategy is unsustainable." Admiral Reeves appeared on the secure video link, his expression cautiously optimistic. "We're receiving multiple signals from the Chinese fleet indicating readiness to withdraw. Their Marine commander on Kinmen Island is requesting permission to stand down and prepare for extraction." "Begin preliminary negotiations," President Hayes ordered. "But maintain the mine perimeter until their naval forces have withdrawn beyond the 24-mile limit." As the crisis began its carefully orchestrated de-escalation, Elisa finally allowed herself a moment to check the flood of messages that had been accumulating on her phone. Hundreds of notifications from social media, news alerts, and text messages from numbers she recognized but hadn't heard from in years. One message stood out from the chaos. "Dr. Foster here. I remember you from high school. The real you, not the version everyone's inventing for the cameras. If you ever need someone to talk to who knew you before all this, my door is open. Angela." Elisa stared at the message for a long moment. In all the media frenzy and revisionist history, Angela was the first person to acknowledge that there might be a cost to maintaining such an elaborate deception for so long. She typed back a single word: "Thanks." Then she deleted the conversation and returned to monitoring the delicate process of ending a crisis that could have reshaped the entire Pacific region. There would be time for personal reflection later. Right now, she has a world to save. 72 hours after the last Chinese warship disappeared beyond the horizon, Elisa Chen stood in the same federal building where her cover story had begun. But instead of carrying a mop and bucket, she wore a crisp navy suit and carried a briefing folder marked with the highest classification levels. The hallways buzzed with activity as intelligence analysts and military personnel prepared damage assessments and strategic recommendations for Congress. The crisis had ended exactly as she'd predicted. Admiral Liu Chen, faced with an impossible tactical situation, had negotiated a face-saving withdrawal that officially characterized the Kinmen landing as a, quote, navigation error during routine exercises. The Chinese Marines had been extracted under the pretense of humanitarian assistance, while their entire Pacific fleet had retreated beyond territorial waters with promises of enhanced communication protocols to prevent future misunderstandings. To the public, it appeared that diplomatic pressure and international condemnation had resolved the crisis peacefully. Only a handful of people knew that the entire confrontation had been orchestrated and concluded by a woman most of America now believed was a simple janitor. "The president wants to see you," General Williams informed her as they walked through corridors that Elisa had once cleaned. "There's talk of a promotion, maybe a position on the National Security Council." Elisa paused at a window overlooking the city, where she'd spent 5 years perfecting her cover identity. Below, she could see the elementary school, where she'd sometimes eaten lunch, observing normal people living normal lives, while she calculated the probability of global thermonuclear war. "What if I said no?" she asked quietly. Williams studied her protégé with concern. "Elisa, you just prevented what could have been World War III. Your strategic thinking saved millions of lives. Why would you even consider walking away?" "Because I'm tired of being a ghost." Elisa's reflections stared back at her from the window glass, and for a moment she saw not the confident strategic analyst, but the lonely woman who had spent 2 decades hiding her true self from the world. Do you know what the hardest part of this whole crisis was? It wasn't military analysis or strategic planning. It was watching people I knew rewrite history to make themselves look better. Quote, she pulled out her phone and showed Williams a news clip featuring Amanda Crenshaw on a morning talk show, describing her close friendship with the mysterious government operative. "This woman spent our entire reunion mocking me for being a failure. Now she's written a book proposal about, quote, growing up with a secret agent." Williams sighed. "The public always needs heroes and villains, Elisa. They can't handle complexity." "That's exactly the problem. I've spent 20 years hiding who I am, letting people believe I was a disappointment, accepting their pity and condescension, all so I could serve my country in secret. But what's the point of saving a world that would rather believe comfortable lies than difficult truths?" Before Williams could respond, Elisa's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in months. Her mother. "Elisa?" Her mother's voice carried a mixture of confusion and pride that Elisa had never heard before. "I just saw the news about you on television. They're saying you work for the government, that you're some kind of important person. Is it true?" Elisa closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decades of carefully constructed deception. "How do you explain to your mother that her disappointment in your life choices had been manufactured?" That every worried phone call about your dead-end job had been based on an elaborate lie designed to protect national security? It's complicated, Mom. The reporter said you've been doing this since college, that you never really were a janitor. Her mother's voice cracked slightly. Why didn't you tell me? All these years I thought you'd given up on your dreams. Because the work required it. Because sometimes, serving something bigger than yourself means letting the people you love think less of you. The conversation ended with promises to talk more later, but Elisa knew that relationship would never be the same. How do you rebuild trust with someone who's spent 2 decades pitying you for choices you never actually made? Meanwhile, back in Colorado Springs, the media circus at Jefferson High had evolved into something resembling a small industry. The school's parking lot had been converted into a permanent press staging area, complete with satellite trucks and temporary broadcast studios. Local businesses were selling I Knew Elisa Chen t-shirts, and the town council was already discussing plans for a historical marker. Thomas Baker had published his investigative piece debunking many of the fabricated stories about Elisa's high school years. His article, titled The Classmates Who Forgot, exposed the gap between how people actually remembered her and how they were now describing her to the media. But his commitment to journalistic truth was being drowned out by more sensational narratives. Dr. Angela Foster had declined all interview requests, choosing instead to quietly process the psychological implications of what they'd witnessed. As someone who studied human behavior professionally, she was fascinated by the collective memory revision happening in real time. Entire groups of people were genuinely convincing themselves that they'd always recognized Elisa's importance, creating false memories to align with current reality. She'd tried reaching out to Elisa again, but her messages went unanswered. Angela understood why, when your entire life becomes public spectacle, genuine human connection becomes nearly impossible to distinguish from opportunism. The reunion committee had announced plans for a special celebration honoring their, quote, most distinguished graduate, completely ignoring the irony that they'd spent the actual reunion mocking her career choices. The cognitive dissonance was stunning, but Angela recognized it as a common psychological defense mechanism. Rather than confront their own failures of judgment, they were rewriting history to cast themselves as supportive friends. Back in Washington, President Hayes met with Elisa in the Oval Office, away from the cameras and classified briefings. The conversation was informal. 2 women discussing the cost of public service in a world that demanded both transparency and secrecy. I know what you're thinking, the president said, settling into her chair with the casual familiarity of someone comfortable with power. That the recognition isn't worth the cost. Maybe it's time to step back and live a normal life. The thought had occurred to me, Elisa admitted. I felt the same way after my first term as senator. The constant scrutiny, the way people projected their own agendas onto everything I said or did. It's exhausting. President Hayes paused, looking out at the rose garden where tourists gathered, hoping for a glimpse of history. But then I realized something important. The work we do isn't for the people who misunderstand us or misrepresent us. It's for the ones who never knew we existed at all. Quote, those Chinese Marines who went home to their families instead of becoming casualties of someone else's political ambition, they'll never know your name. The Taiwanese children who'll grow up in freedom instead of occupation, they'll never thank you. The American families who didn't lose sons and daughters in the Pacific War, they'll never realize how close they came to tragedy. Elisa considered this perspective, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the famous windows. So I continue living a lie? You continue living a truth that most people aren't ready to understand. There's a difference. The president leaned forward, her expression serious. The world needs people like you, Elisa. People who can make the hard decisions without needing credit. Who can sacrifice their own recognition for the greater good. That's not a curse. It's a calling. As the meeting concluded, Elisa found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could accept the promotion, continue serving in shadows and secrets, knowing that her greatest accomplishments would remain hidden from history. Or she could walk away, reclaim her identity, and live with the knowledge that she'd turned her back on a world that desperately needed her unique talents. Standing on the steps of the White House as evening settled over Washington, Elisa made her decision. She pulled out her phone and composed a text message to Dr. Angela Foster. coffee sometime? I think I'm ready to talk to someone who knew me before I became a headline. Then she walked back into the building where the real work of protecting democracy happened in shadows and silence, carried out by people whose names would never appear in history books, but whose choices shaped the destiny of nations. The reunion had ended, but Elisa Chen's real story was just beginning, and this time, she wouldn't have to face it entirely alone. 6 months later, Elisa Chen sat across from Dr. Angela Foster in a quiet coffee shop in downtown Denver, far from the media circus that had consumed their hometown. The autumn sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm light on a conversation that had been 20 years in the making. "You look different," Angela observed, studying her former classmate with professional interest. "More at peace somehow." Quote. Elisa wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, savoring the simple pleasure of a normal conversation with someone who had known her before she became a national mystery. "I suppose I am. There's something liberating about not having to pretend anymore, at least not with everyone." The Pacific Crisis, as historians were already calling it, had fundamentally shifted global power dynamics. China's failed probe had exposed critical weaknesses in their military planning and forced a comprehensive reevaluation of their Pacific strategy. Taiwan's semiconductor facilities had implemented new security protocols that made them virtually impossible to capture intact, while American economic warfare capabilities had proven far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. But these macro-political changes meant little to Elisa compared to the personal transformation she'd undergone. The woman who had spent decades hiding behind a janitor's uniform now served openly as senior strategic analyst for Pacific Affairs, her insights shaping policy at the highest levels of government. "The hardest part wasn't the secrecy itself," Elisa continued, her voice carrying the weight of years of isolation. "It was watching people I cared about lose respect for me based on a lie I couldn't correct. My mother spent 20 years worrying that she'd failed as a parent because her brilliant daughter had, quote, thrown her life away." Angela nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent years studying human psychology. Cognitive dissonance is a powerful force. People need their perceptions to align with reality, so when reality shifts suddenly, they either reject it or rewrite their memories to make it fit. Like our classmates claiming they always knew I was special. Exactly. Amanda Crenshaw has probably convinced herself that her version of events is true. The alternative, admitting she was wrong about someone she considered beneath her, is too psychologically threatening. Through the coffee shop window, they could see a small crowd gathered around a television in the electronics store across the street. The news was showing footage from the latest congressional hearing on Pacific security, where Elisa had testified publicly for the first time about strategic threats in the region. Her face was now recognized worldwide, her analysis quoted by foreign policy experts and military strategists. "Do you ever miss the invisibility?" Angela asked. Elisa considered this carefully. "Sometimes. There was a purity to the work when no one knew who was doing it. Every success was about the mission, not the recognition. Now I have to consider how my recommendations will play in the media, and how they'll affect my public image." "But you're still making a difference." "Yes, but differently. The teenager who went to NASA dreamed of changing the world through brilliant discoveries. The woman I became learned that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, through careful analysis and strategic thinking rather than dramatic breakthroughs." Angela leaned forward, her psychiatrist's instincts engaging with a puzzle she'd been contemplating for months. "I've been thinking about the psychological cost of what you did. Maintaining a false identity for decades, accepting condescension and pity from people who didn't understand your true value. That level of sustained deception would break most people." "It nearly broke me," Elisa admitted. "There were nights I'd lie awake, wondering if I was the person everyone thought I was, or the person I knew myself to be. When your entire social identity is fabricated, you start to lose track of what's real. What kept you grounded? The work itself. Every analysis I completed, every crisis I helped resolve, every conflict I helped prevent, those were real. The impact was real, even if the recognition wasn't." Elisa paused, watching a young couple at the next table share photos on their phones, living their lives in the open without secrets or deception. And knowing that somewhere in Taiwan or Japan or even China, there were families who would never know how close they came to losing everything. The conversation was interrupted by Angela's phone buzzing with a news alert. She glanced at it and frowned. Speaking of our classmates, Marcus Webb is running for city council. His campaign slogan is, "The leadership Colorado Springs needs," and his website prominently features a photo of him with you from the reunion. Elisa laughed, a sound that carried both amusement and resignation. Of course it does. The same man who spent the evening questioning my life choices is now using our friendship to boost his political credentials. It bothers you. It used to, but I've learned something important about human nature. People will always reshape the truth to serve their needs. Fighting that tendency is like fighting gravity. You exhaust yourself without changing anything fundamental. Quote, Angela studied her former classmate with growing admiration. The shy, brilliant teenager had evolved into someone who understood power not just in terms of military strategy or economic leverage, but in terms of human psychology and social dynamics. What about the future? Angela asked. Where does Elisa Chen go from here? Forward, Elisa said simply. There are new challenges emerging every day. Climate change is creating resource conflicts that could destabilize entire regions. Artificial intelligence is changing the nature of warfare faster than policy can adapt. Space is becoming militarized in ways that would have seemed like science fiction when we were in high school. She pulled up a classified briefing on her phone, then thought better of it and put the device away. I've been asked to head a new task force on emerging threats. It would mean more public visibility, more testimony before Congress, more opportunities for people like Marcus to use my name for their own benefit. But you're going to do it anyway. Yes, because someone has to think about these problems, and I've discovered I'm good at it. Not just the analysis, but the human element. Understanding how leaders make decisions under pressure, how cultural factors influence strategic thinking, how psychological warfare can be more effective than conventional weapons. Angela raised her coffee cup in a mock toast to the girl who disappeared and the woman who emerged. Elisa clinked her mug against Angela's, smiling genuinely for the first time in months, to second chances and real friends. As they prepared to leave, Angela had one final question. Do you think our classmates will ever understand what really happened? What did you actually sacrifice to do this work? Elisa considered this as she gathered her things. Some will, eventually, the ones who are capable of growth and self-reflection. Others will continue living in their revised histories, where they were always supportive and insightful. But that's not my responsibility anymore. She stood and looked out at the bustling street, where ordinary people went about their daily lives, protected by systems and safeguards they would never fully comprehend. I used to think that serving my country meant sacrificing my identity. Now I realize it means being honest about who I am and using my abilities where they can do the most good. Quote, They walked out into the Denver afternoon, two women who had found their paths through different means but arrived at similar understanding. Angela would return to her practice, helping patients navigate the complexities of human psychology. Elisa would return to Washington, where new crises demanded her unique combination of analytical brilliance and strategic insight. But for the first time in decades, Elisa Chen walked forward, without looking over her shoulder, without calculating the cost of being seen. She had learned that the most important secret wasn't her identity or her work. It was understanding that she could be both the person the world needed her to be and the person she chose to become. The reunion was finally, truly over. The real reunion, with herself, had just begun. As she drove back toward the airport and the classified briefings that awaited her in Washington, Elisa's phone rang one final time. The caller ID showed a number from Jefferson High School. Ms. Chen, this is Principal Martinez. I know this might sound unusual, but we're planning our next reunion, and the committee was wondering if you might consider being our keynote speaker. After everything that's happened, the class would love to hear from you about service and success, and finding your path in life. Elisa smiled as she navigated through traffic, thinking about the gymnasium where this all began, about the people who had dismissed her dreams and were now eager to claim association with her achievements. I'll consider it, she said, but if I do speak, I'm going to tell them the truth, all of it, including the parts that might make them uncomfortable. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The truth? About the cost of real service, about the difference between recognition and impact, about the courage it takes to let people underestimate you while you work to protect everything they care about. Another pause. That sounds very honest. It is, and if they're ready to hear it, I'm ready to share it, but I won't be part of another fantasy where everyone pretends they always believed in me. She ended the call and continued toward the airport, where a government plane waited to carry her back to the work that defined her, challenged her, and ultimately fulfilled her in ways her 18-year-old self could never have imagined. The janitor's secret was finally out, but Elisa Chen's story was far from over. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.